Have you watched Game of Thrones?
Yeah, loved it.
You familiar with that amazing Littlefinger quote? Chaos isn't a pit,
It's a
chaos
ladder.
is a ladder.
Yeah.
And I think that quote is very applicable to the current paradigm we find ourselves in. And there's sort of like a dual purpose to that, right? On the one hand, I think that this sort of chaos is a ladder mindset is very much what the current admin is doing. They are, I think, intentionally sowing seeds of chaos to sort of like ascend some sort of ladder, right? And to achieve a better outcome. And I also think as an investor right now, chaos is a financial ladder, right? You have the ability, I think, to ascend financially via the current chaotic state of the world. And you mentioned this being about China, and I think that's absolutely correct, right? Like there's a school of thought that this is all about like bringing jobs back home and everything, and that doesn't make sense to me because given the constraints you have, like you can't bring jobs home in a year. You
Right.
can't like reshore, you can't build all this stuff, right? But like what can you accomplish in a year? Well, I think you could forcibly realign like all of the world trade that currently happens like away from China and towards, if not like the US, like the US sphere of influence. Maybe that's why, we talked about how these, like South America in particular was just entirely 10%, right? Just sitting there right underneath us. And that, we could be using all of this like economic pain to basically coerce all of our allies into sort of like aligning away from China and towards the US. And I think this is especially interesting when you consider what's been happening with the yuan, right? And for those people who don't know, I mean, the Chinese government has basically like manipulated the yuan for like a very, very long time. And China walks this kind of delicate balance where they want the currency to sort of be artificially weak because it makes the demand for their goods greater. Like if the Chinese yuan is weak and the dollar is strong, then if you're in the US, you demand a lot of Chinese goods because they're so comparatively like inexpensive to make. And if your currency gets strong, you have to start paying like more money comparatively for those goods, then it, can have like this sort of downward effect on exports, right? Are you familiar with like the famous George Soros trade with the Bank of England?
Didn't he shorted the pound? Is that what he did?
Shorted the pound, right? Basically bet on the peg breaking. And um, I don't know if you're familiar, but like Scott Bessent or Bessent or however you say this guy's freaking name. I'm just going to keep calling him Bessent.
Yeah, I like
Stop
Besson.
agonizing over this. Scott Bessent was working for
He was working for
Soros at the
Soros at that
time.
time. Okay.
And the current situation, like it makes me wonder, like, is this a play to break the yuan? Like, a lot of people are kind of thinking that the yuan going, the Chinese, they want the yuan to go down. They're manipulating it down now, and this is bad for us. But there's an extent where the yuan falling off a cliff becomes like incredibly destabilizing for China, because if the yuan gets like too low, like this sort of sequence starts happening, right? And the sequence kind of goes like this, right? Let's start at the beginning. We tariff China. Tariffing China reduces demand for Chinese exports, right? Easy enough
Yes.
to follow. The exports are more expensive, right? This in turn lowers the inflow of dollars into China, right? Meaning that there is now downward pressure on the yuan,
Yep.
right? Because China doesn't have these dollars to turn around and like recycle and do sorts of various things to sort of like manipulate their currency, right? So the yuan starts getting devalued. If your currency gets devalued too much, you start seeing capital flight. You
Right.
start
Because I guess if
seeing,
you're investing in local currency and the currency is depreciating, then that's like a negative investment return.
and then you start seeing rising defaults, real estate and such. And then we have to understand too, like the Chinese economy is already like shaky, right? They're already in kind of like a maybe deflationary scenario right now.
Right. I've
So now,
seen like a real estate bubble that's on the verge of bursting like every year.
so you can imagine this like kind of scenario taking place where you start having capital flight, the currency is going down, the economy starts, deteriorating even more because there's less income coming in, from these manufacturers. Defaults rise, and then the Chinese government has to start like stimulating to sort of like paper over some of this disaster, right? But in doing so, you sort of set off this like reflexive cycle where like the more you stimulate, like the more downward pressure you put on the currency, and then the more like capital wants to flee, right? And then eventually this like yuan depreciation becomes disorderly, right? And then you get this sort of, maybe situation that we had with the pound investment in the 90s where this thing sort of ultimately deteriorates. And of course, the end game to this is like social tensions and disaster for the CCP.
That's interesting because, what you're saying, I like it. I like what you're saying. I'm noticing a couple things here. Like one, it's like China wants to keep their currency artificially low so that their exports are competitive. But if it gets too low, then they get a whole new set of problems. And these problems could be disastrous, is what you're saying.
Yeah. And as far as like what the trade is here, the trade right now is to long Bitcoin, because anytime you have capital restrictions becoming like a phenomenon, if that starts spreading throughout all of Asia, like some sort of contagion,
yeah,
where does capital wants to flow to escape like a system?
Right.
Probably
and
wants to flow to Bitcoin.
In addition, like what you said, if China has to basically print money to get themselves out of the problem, then that also helps Bitcoin price.
And then I think investors like outside of the country start using Bitcoin as like a hedge. You have multiple ways to win with the Bitcoin trade, because not only are you winning from like actual capital flight into the asset, but Bitcoin has also become this sort of like barometer for policymaker panic, a barometer for future liquidity injections. Like the market kind of knows the game right now. And I think that's why it's like an interesting time to be investing in Bitcoin, because on the one hand, we used to think, well, let's just buy it when there's a disaster and then everything's down and we buy Bitcoin, and then Bitcoin goes up because they inject liquidity or they reenact QE or whatever they do, right? And then we all live happily ever after. But the game can't be like that easy all the time, right? Like everybody kind of knows that's the playbook, which is one of the main reasons why I deployed so heavily last week, is because I think there is a decent scenario where like the bottom is in fact in. And like I can even see a scenario where we rip to like 120K from here, and then there's like a disaster and Bitcoin melts down, but it only melts down to like 85K or something, and then you're still in at the bottom.
Okay, so I like this. I mean, where my mind went is that there's a few trades you could do. One is Bitcoin, and that seems to like be the easiest one. There's like shorting the yuan, which is something that you talked about offline. I think there's a third one, which is like investing in areas that might benefit if Chinese manufacturing like loses its stronghold. So maybe like South America or Central America, something like that. I think those are also interesting, but Bitcoin seems like the easiest one, because also you have like just math working on your side. Like Bitcoin's going up anyways over the long term. You don't have to like overthink it too much.
Yeah, I mean, look, whenever you're investing too, you have this kind of conundrum of like, well, what is like the actual thesis, and how do I directly invest in that thesis versus like, oh, I'm investing in these sort of proxies to the thesis. So then the more you're like a proxy to the actual thesis, the more like these other confounding variables can get in the way, and like something that you thought was going to happen doesn't end up happening because you invested in the proxy instead of the exact thesis, right? But like right now, I think that the trade actually is like the main trade happening in the world right now is like a yuan pressure trade. And if you look at this chart, I mean, it's pretty obvious, I think, what this chart wants to do. I mean, this is like your classic little ascending triangle here, and I think this pops. And this is the dollar versus the yuan, right? So when this chart is going up, the yuan is going down.
Yeah.
Right. The most direct and interesting way to play this, if you can, is probably to sort of short the yuan and then immediately buy Bitcoin. Like that becomes like a really, really interesting trade. You get a scenario where the yuan like just snap devalues like 20 or 30%. And then all the Bitcoin you buy in US dollars is like immediately relatively worth like 20 or 30% more to you. And then on top of that, if Bitcoin sort of becomes this like release valve for all this stuff, the US dollar price of Bitcoin goes up, and now you're really juicing this trade and
you're hitting it from both sides. I like that. In terms of vehicles, like ways to trade this, I mean, we were just looking on Interactive Brokers, which allows you to trade Forex. And I like trade currencies on Interactive Brokers quite often, but not the Yuan. So I don't even know if you can do it. But there's probably some like ETFs where you can express this short Yuan trade.
Yeah, there are no ETFs I know of to do that. I mean, this is sort of like an idea I just kind of cooked up like, 30 minutes before we started recording. So I would like to see if there's a way to put this on, but the simplified way to put this on is still to just long Bitcoin.